there is something so significant about the story and so yes, the day that is attached to it, because that's what we associate in our minds and our cultures, but there's something so important there that the world recognizes it, that, even when you talk about the so-called war on Christmas, why is there a war on Christmas? Because they recognize the significance of it, that if this actually happened, it changes everything.
Well, welcome to Calvary Conversations, a ministry of Calvary University in Kansas City, Missouri. I'm Mike Dodds, your host, one of the four, for a conversation about Christmas today. I'm joined by the other Calvary hosts here, Shaun LePage, Department Chair for Ministry Studies, Tim Hange, Department Chair for English, and Josh Paxton, the Director of the Burnham Center for Global Engagement. Welcome, guys.
Good to be here.
There's a major holiday, holy day, let's say it that way, coming up, Christmas, a great season for everybody. And I mean, not just Christians, but everybody in our culture. There's a lot of expectation and a lot of hope. But yet there's a lot of myth going on around Christmas. Sometimes we run into that as Christians and we wonder, should we be involved with that or should we not? How do we discern? So we want to discuss some of those things. Which should we clearly avoid? What things should we engage with caution as Christians? And which should we employ with a clear conscience, if we could say it that way? Now, we only got 26 minutes or a little less, so there's no way we're going to cover it all. And so it's going to be sort of a free-for-all. But what we want to do for you, our listeners, is to set hopefully in your context like in ours, what's a biblical framework for evaluating them all? If you're a parent with kids in the home, you're right there. You're trying to make decisions about what goes on in the school and your own family. And if you're a ministry leader, boy, people are going to have some interesting suggestions. And so you have to filter those through. But wherever you're at, we're just going to have a good conversation here about Christmas and Christmas traditions. And so I'm going to throw out some questions or a statement and let our hosts respond. And the first one is, was the little drummer boy really there at the manger? The song says he was.
Yeah, his name was Bob, I think, right?
Yeah, right.
That's in first Maccabees 2, right?
I don't know. The song was written in 1951, and yeah, they picked the little boy there. Probably a metaphor.
As I said before, Mike, the real question here is not whether or not the little drummer boy was there, but how long are we going to let the baby shiver in the cold while we heap precious metals on him until we give him a blanket?
The smelting process or something, yeah.
Which, if you're not clear, that's a reference to another Christmas song, by the way.
Yes, it is.
Well, let's just jump in the middle of it. There are people that raise the issue that there are some pagan issues with this celebration that are out there. I don't know a lot about it. Saturnalia, the celebrations that began with the Romans. Sol Invictus, the invincible sun, S-U-N, celebrated on December 25th about the renewal of the Sun King. Boy, and then you talk about candles and trees and other symbols used at Christmas. Don't they all have a pagan origin, and therefore we should avoid them?
It's interesting. When as I was growing up, my parents actually have the verse pulled up here. They refer to this verse in Jeremiah 10, said, basically, do not learn the ways of the pagan nations, for the practices of the people are worthless. They cut a tree out of the forest. A craftsman shapes it with his chisel. They adorn it with silver and gold. They fasten it with hammer and nails so it will not totter. And they talk about it being an idol. And but my parents were taught as young believers to see this as a warning about the Christmas tree. And so they did not allow Christmas trees in our home growing up. So it was really, and So when I moved out on my own, the very first Christmas, of course, I put up a tree. But it wasn't as out of rebellion, but it was.
You hypocrite.
Well, for me though, there was no rebellious ilk to it at all. I just had determined in my mind, it's just it's like in Romans 14, like so much, Romans 13, 14, where Paul talks about the meat being sacrificed to idols, right? I mean, if you talk about, this is like a perfect discussion for that verse, right?
Yes.
If can a tree be adorned in a pagan, and used in a pagan ritual? Sure. Can that same tree be adorned and used as a Christian symbol to draw our attention to the things of God? Well, as Paul says, that's going to largely depend on the person. And for me, I never had an issue with the pagan imagery behind it. I've always decorated the trees, in fact, in a way that I think was honoring to God and honoring to our family. So but there are still some Christians who have that point of view. I've had one in one of my classes, actually, who, not this semester, but who had that opinion.
Yeah, Tim, if I could segue from that a little bit, I have Romans 14 open in front of me because my mind immediately went to that same thing. But Romans 14 5, one person esteems one day as better than another, while another esteems all days alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. The one who observes the day observes it in honor of the Lord. The one who eats in honor of the Lord, since he gives thanks to God, while the one who abstains in honor of the Lord and give thanks to God. And that verse pretty much addresses exactly, everything surrounding this particular topic. And it's interesting, while we're framing that in the context of Christmas, okay, my intercultural studies hat is coming on a little bit, and that whenever we're in a situation where we share the gospel with another people group, and we find that people group has traditions and they have celebrations and they have practices that might have been assigned to worshiping the sun or some other deity or whatever, now there comes a time of transition, if you will, where either they're going to get rid of those practices completely, or they're going to transition those practices to being God-centered and focused on the worship of God. They're going to reframe them, redefine them. And what's really important is not so much the practice, but the way people think about the practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'll throw out maybe a deep dive on this one. I do think, though, that Christians, well-meaning Christians, can engage in idolatry at Christmas time by putting something else above the message of Christmas. Bonhoeffer spoke about this extensively in some of his devotionals, most of which were written from a prison camp. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was the minister who had opposed Hitler and was put in prison for it, in prison camp for it. He really railed against the sentimentality of Christmas. And I think we have to be very careful as Christians. Often what we should not mistake the good feelings of Christmas time as being something that is necessarily righteous or holy or good for us spiritually. In fact, they're often very distracting, because what we're getting wrapped up in is the sentimentality of the holiday, as opposed to the raw meaning of the message. As Bonhoeffer says, Christmas comes to us in the midst of the rubble, right? And the more, in fact, in some ways, the more desperate your situation is, perhaps you are actually more capable of understanding and feeling the true Christian message of the incarnation of Christ. The other thing too that Bonhoeffer talks about a lot is how the Advent should be pointing us to the second Advent, right? It's not this sentimentality of just the past, right? This is part of a story that is ongoing, and Christians sometimes can think of Christmas and Easter as the end of the story, when indeed Christ is returning, and in the end, he will make all things new, and that is the real Advent, the most cogent Advent that we are still waiting for. So just a thought, because Bonhoeffer really challenged me with that. I would really challenge anybody listening to this. Don't let the sentimentality of Christmas become an idol that actually displaces the true message of Christmas in your heart. I think that's easy for Christians to do.
Yeah, I love that. I've still been here looking through the birth narratives for the drummer boy. I still can't find him. been trying to find. I thought that for sure that was in there, but
Hezekiah 2:2.
Hezekiah, what? Anyway, but I have several thoughts as well. But I was kind of focused on just the idea that really all of this stuff does present itself as an opportunity for conversation, about what the Bible actually does say, and who was actually there at the birth of Jesus, and what the birth of Jesus actually does represent, and the miraculous things that took place there. All of this does, I think, even like the whole issue of the tree, and I forget what the Old Testament passage was that you referred to. Was that you, Tim? That
Jeremiah 10, yeah.
Jeremiah 10. Okay. Even that, it's important to, you can have a conversation with somebody about, reading something in its context, and, what was really happening there. Is this Jeremiah's diatribe against Christmas trees, or was it actual, intentional idolatry? And of course, it's the latter.
Yeah.
So even that presents, the opportunity for us to go, to get people to turn to the scriptures and to read things in context, and that kind of thing, as well as, I think it's good that you guys have referred to Romans 14, and just the fact that, there is a room for a difference of opinion on this, but it should drive us to, have conversations about, the true meaning and the true message, and what, what is God doing? And I love it, Tim, that you're driving us to the, what Bonhoeffer said about the second Advent, because so many people missed the first Advent, and still to this day, missed the first Advent. So, let's use Christmas to remind them that Jesus actually promised to come again. This time not as a baby in Bethlehem, or poor and unknown to most of the world, but visible to everybody, and the King of Kings. So that's a great emphasis. But my main point is just that we should use these things for having conversations with people and getting them to think more biblically about things.
Yeah. Let me throw another angle at us all. In the Bible, there are, as you just referred to, Shaun, there are details about the Christmas narrative that we need to be aware of. But there are some other things that are present too, that other denominations, and I'm going to use that in a broad sense, I didn't grow up celebrating some other, several of you used the word Advent. What's the Advent season? We don't need to talk about an Advent wreath or anything like that, but that's a broader term that Christian church has used about Christmas. Epiphany, we talked about Epiphany, one of the days that people celebrate in other traditions. But then there's some Jewish holidays. Hanukkah. Should Christians be celebrating Hanukkah? What's the biblical precedent? Yeah, it's not in biblical history in one sense, but yet many people refer to John 8 as a place where Christ might be referring to Hanukkah. So what's your take, guys, on those broader biblical issues? Should Christians be involved?
Mike, I think I think for me, your question comes honestly, it comes back to the Romans 14 passage, and also as believers we have great freedom in what we engage in, what holidays we celebrate, what holidays we might not celebrate, and the celebration of Christmas or Hanukkah, or dare I say it, Halloween, is not something that is, you know, sinful in and of itself, so much as what's your reason behind celebrating that. And even as Tim made some comments earlier that harken us back to the fact that anything can become an idol. Anything can be celebrated incorrectly if our mindset about that isn't right. So um I I don't celebrate Hanukkah, but I don't celebrate Hanukkah because I'm not Jewish. If I had a Jewish friend and they invited me to a Hanukkah celebration, then I would have absolutely no problem going and participating and taking part in that and getting to know them and learning more about how they celebrate that holiday. So I guess that's my personal response to that.
The thing that strikes me is that, well, first of all, a lot of this is history, like Santa Claus. Was there really a Saint Nicholas? And is this someone that we should fear or emulate? Looking at the history of even some of these songs and why they were written, and and looking at Epiphany and Hanukkah and those things, it's pretty interesting history. So, on one level, we can just encourage people to go do some digging and read some history about these things, and maybe that's helpful. But the other thing that strikes me that as important here, again, referring to Romans 14, Paul says that, who are you to pass judgment on the servant of another? And so really what we have to do with this, I think, is to be wise, to not condemn anybody for doing, something that we think is wise or unwise, but also to approach these conversations with wisdom, and to not come across as condemning or whatever. And also, we should be wise in the way that we celebrate as well, because like a lot of my own family's traditions, I've found, can be a real distraction for my own kids as they've been growing up. And I'm like, wow, maybe I should be a little bit more wise in how I celebrate Christmas and more intentional. But also just, we don't want to give people the wrong message. We don't want people to think that we're caught up in the commercialism of these things, and that we condone certain things. And we don't want to send the wrong message, even if, it's not what we intentionally believe. But I think, it's important for us to celebrate with wisdom and to consider, how might someone interpret this? How might someone see this? And just, maybe even, I think, Josh, you referred to our freedom. Maybe, I think of Paul saying he gives up his freedom at times, to win people. So maybe, we need to consider what freedoms we have here, that we should perhaps give up or be very, very private about, rather than miscommunicate and maybe even damage our witness.
That's a good point, Sean.
You mentioned Epiphany, and I do want to point this out. It's really important that we not throw. Evangelical Christians, there's some tension between us and Catholics, obviously, and Eastern Orthodox. There tends to be a sense on our side that Eastern Orthodoxy and Catholicism have a high degree of focus on form and less on function. But I would say that Epiphany is an interesting holiday, and I wish some of what it focuses on was more celebrated at Christmas, because Epiphany focuses It depends on whether you're in Catholic or Eastern Orthodox tradition, but it focuses on the visit, on Christ's incarnation, the visit of the Magi, and the impact that the signal that Christ was going to reach out, that Christ was for the Gentiles, not just for the Jews. The baptism of Christ, but all of that is around the incarnation, the mystery of the incarnation of the Word made flesh, and I think that's pretty valid. I wish, having looked at Epiphany, I wish that we in the evangelical church either emphasized that day also, or a day for that also, or made that more a part of the discussion of Christmas.
That's good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's good.
Let's flip flop. We've been talking sacred and biblical. Do you all run into the war on Christmas? Remember a number of years back where you go into stores and they were told, the receptionists were told to not, say Merry Christmas, say Happy Holidays.
Wasn't there an actor who put out a documentary about that?
Could have been. How should we respond? We don't want to be offensive. There are people that it's just definitely not a religious holiday at all. It's a good family tradition, family time. So how should we come back?
I have two thoughts. One, why would we expect people who are not Christians to celebrate a Christian holiday? Mic drop. And the other one being, let's be honest, that Christmas in our culture, from a cultural standpoint, has become so much about, it has nothing, from a cultural standpoint, it has nothing to do with Christ's birth. So if our culture is our culture at war against Christianity in not wanting to say Merry Christmas, or are they at war at something else that frankly we don't care whether they battle against that or not, because it's not irrelevant.
Yeah, I think it's a complex kind of thing, really. It's not as, for me, I think, and the way I understand some of that struggle is it's an issue of free speech. That if we're talking about, our government or other organizations trying to limit free speech, then frankly, I'm on board with rebelling against that, because I believe free speech is a massively wonderful right that we have in this country. And as you can see, what's happening in China right now, it's a true blessing to have freedom of speech. So I think that's a good thing to rebel against that. But I think you're right, Mike, that we don't want to be offensive to anybody who is obviously offended by our celebrations of Christmas. That's not the point, to offend people or to cram it in their face. But I think personally, I've been wishing people happy or Merry Christmas for a long time now. I won't say how many years, but at least since I was saved in 1982. I've been wishing people Merry Christmas, and I've never ever known of anybody who was offended by that. So I think it's largely an overblown issue. But I think really, we also need to just be sensitive one way or the other.
Yeah. I think there's been some backlash against it. Honestly, I think people sort of got tired of the judgmentalism that occurred on that side, and I think just the way that I approach it is, of course, if I'm working with a Jewish coworker, I'm not going to necessarily wish him a Merry Christmas, right? I want to be sensitive in that regard, but I also don't see a problem if in my office I had a little nativity or something. I wouldn't expect somebody to get on to me for celebrating that this time of year in the way that I see fit, just the way I would not get onto them for celebrating Hanukkah or any other if they just call it a holiday season and they want to keep it secular, of course, I'm not going to force my view on them, but it also doesn't limit. I put very few limitations on how I express it personally, because actually none, because it's important to me as Christmas. It's important to me as the birth of Christ. So, yeah.
Let me ask us to think about the songs that everyone in the culture sings. And one of the things in the songs that everybody sings, we all sing the joy to the world or whatever. And do we really believe it? That's the question I'm going toward. One of them is the virgin birth. Everybody sings about it. I've never run into a non-Christian that had a struggle with that miraculous event. Is the virgin birth really that central to Christmas?
See, now that's it. I feel like, Mike, I almost feel like your question is a little bit loaded, because the virgin birth is absolutely central to Christianity. It's absolutely central to our faith. It's vital to our knowledge of who Christ is, that he was born of a virgin, and there's a lot of reasons that we don't have enough time to get into for that. Is it important to Christmas? That I almost feel like that's a completely different question. Because on the one hand, it's vital to our faith, it's central to our knowledge of who Jesus is. The other is talking about the holiday of Christmas. I guess it depends on how you celebrate Christmas, and if your celebration of Christmas is focused on the birth of Christ, then the answer would be yes, the virgin birth is essential to that.
Yeah.
I once heard a secular music critic doing a commentary on I forget which Christmas album it was. I was on NPR. It was an interview, and at the end of it, this person said, that the Christian religious imagery was rich here with the virgin birth, with and I remember he mentioned specifically the virgin birth, and he said, "I'm not a believer, but this time of year and music like this makes me wish in some ways that I was." But I think so. Does he get offended at the virgin birth? Does he look at it and say, to a lot of people though, that's all that it is. It's a nice story. And I would say the story of the virgin birth as mythology should not be what's important. The fact of the virgin birth, I mean, it is. I think it's essential to the Christmas story.
Yes,
the
God
divine
in
nature,
flesh.
God in flesh. That's what tells us that Christ was divine. The fact that there was no man involved, that it was a conception brought about through the Holy Spirit. So yeah, I think it's pretty important. I think it's part of the magic to those who consider as mythology, and the meaning to those of us who for whom it is reality.
Yeah, I think it's a good example, Mike, of how we should be taking advantage of this season to have conversations with people. I think the virgin birth is like, I heard a radio commentator saying, a few years ago, he was talking about how if I believed that was true, I would tell everybody. You couldn't shut me up if I believed that God became a man. If the virgin birth is true, he was saying, then it changes everything. And so, do we? I have to ask: do we as Christians really believe that it was so monumental in the history of humanity that everybody must know, and I can't help myself but talk about it, So it's just a great example of how we should be using this season to have conversations with people and helping them understand, because this changed the world. What was it about Jesus that made him so special? Was it because he was a revolutionary or because he was a great teacher? No, he was God and man. God visited our planet. And if we can't talk about that in fact, I'm not limited to talking about that during this season, but this season does provide us with a great opportunity to let people know about the one of the most amazing events of all history.
Yeah. So you're answering my final question that I had jotted down. What is the true meaning of Christmas? In the midst of it all, what do we want to make sure our families understand, our friends, our coworkers, wherever we're living? What is that? Final comments, guys. Did Shaun steal all our thunder here?
Well, I do think,
God became man and lived among us.
God became a man.
Yeah.
God became a man. He visited our planet.
Yeah.
My absolute favorite nativity passage is one that I don't think we use often enough in the nativity, which is John 1. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld the glory of the Father, full of grace and truth. And it talks about he came into his own, and his own received him not.
Right.
But to as many as received him, to them he gave the power to become the sons of God. And that is not a sentimental message. That is a message that should be a message to people who hear that and reach out for it in desperation. Because they understand they need something that only Christ will offer. Yeah. That, as Christ said, I will be lifted up and all men will be drawn to me. Like if it's that imagery of the serpent being lifted up, that object of scorn being lifted up in the desert, and people looking upon it and receiving salvation, right? That's what Christmas really is. That's the message of Christmas. And there are some beautiful things about the Christmas story. Do not get me wrong, but at its core, it's a story of how a messed up humanity gets salvation, and that gives me chills every time. So,
yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Whether he was actually born on December 25th or whatever the history of that day may be, whether it involves presents and trees and wreaths, whatever, there is something about the story of God becoming flesh that we associate with the holiday of Christmas that is so significant that even the world recognizes it, even if they don't necessarily want to give themselves fully to it. I mean, in World War I forget the year, but they stopped fighting on Christmas Day. The two forces met in an open field and they played football with one another, and then the very next day they went right back to killing each other. But there is something so significant about the story and so yes, the day that is attached to it, because that's what we associate in our minds and our cultures, but there's something so important there that the world recognizes it, that even when you talk about the so-called war on Christmas, why is there a war on Christmas? Because they recognize the significance of it, that if this actually happened, it changes everything.
Amen.
Yeah, absolutely. Josh, I was reading an article just recently about all the parallels between the first century and our current century, and I'm not going to get into all those details, but there was all kinds of stats about multiculturalism and whatever else. But they were basically saying that we live in a time that was very similar to what the apostles, the first century church, dealt with as far as paganism and attitudes towards Christianity and all this kind of stuff. There are a lot of parallels, which is a little bit scary and disappointing if you think about it. That our culture has lost something. And the church has declined and whatever. And we can talk about those things another time maybe, but in another sense, I think it should be exciting to us. We get to reintroduce the people of our time to this amazing truth and the fact that God became a man, that this incarnation is so significant, that God invaded our planet and the darkness couldn't handle it, as John says. Darkness couldn't deal with it. Light came into the world through Jesus, and we get to shine that light. And the darker our culture gets, the brighter the light is. And so I think, I just encourage anybody who's listening that we get to reintroduce them to this amazing truth, this amazing story that we're all a part of. And we shouldn't back down. We shouldn't be timid about that. We should be gracious and loving. And really, the most loving thing we can do is to share with the people around us that God has come. God is with us, and we don't have to be lost on a sea of despair and hopelessness, because God is with us. He has come in the flesh. It's an amazing truth.
Amen. Well, guys, we're out of time, and I hate to cut us off, but boy, our prayer for our listeners, for you all, as you've been joining us in this conversation, is the Lord will pique your mind for opportunities to share Christ. May the world receive the King, as we sing, and then we say, Maranatha, come back again, Jesus. Thanks for joining us for our conversation here at Calvary Conversations. Join us again.
Merry Christmas.
Bless your Christmas. Bye-bye.
Merry Christmas.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Calvary Conversations, a service of Calvary University in Kansas City, Missouri. We invite you to participate in the conversation by contacting us through the Calvary University website, calvary.edu, or by calling us at 816-322-0110. Join us again next week for another Calvary Conversation.